Hello and welcome to another episode of the Lateral Think Podcast. Today I'm joined by Susan Lowell. Susan, how are you today?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
Good. So, to provide some context to this conversation, can you give us a background of who you are, which I know for myself, I'm also personally curious to think about where you have gotten to now, and in particular, your interest, passion, and curiosity around the concept of biotensegrity.
Sure. So my full actual last name is Lowell De Solórzano. Kind of long. And I've been married over 40 years and my mother still has a difficult time with the Solórzano part. So um just to clarify that. I'm a 68-year-old grandmother living in Washington, D.C.
Mhm.
Um my background, my crooked path to biotensegrity has gone through. I've been a singer-songwriter, I've been a ship model builder, I've been a teacher, I've been a lot of different things, worked in a lot of different worlds.
Hmm.
Started doing Tai Chi in 1983. And so I'm also a Tai Chi teacher. And soon around the same time discovered the movement science as seen through Arthur Lessack's eyes, Lessac, and voice work, which changed between that and Tai Chi. It changed how I was moving my body to perform.
Hmm.
So that was great. Studying Tai Chi, um, there are things you study. There are traditional writings called the Tai Chi classics,
Mhm.
and some of them are very straightforward and, move like a cat about to catch a rat, stand like a mountain, move like a great river.
Hmm.
And some of them were a little more confusing, a little more enigmatic. And so I just sort of would read different translations and think, what are they talking about?
Hmm.
When one thing moves, everything moves. When one thing stops, everything stops.
Hmm.
And the body it functions as a unit with all the different aspects threaded together,
Hmm.
different things that didn't make sense, and I just sort of said okay. So when I discovered biotensegrity, that's when that started to make sense. I'm not sure I'm answering your question in a
Well,
straight line.
no, look, there's a couple of interesting things to consider there because I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about what Tai Chi is because that's probably a something that's been influential in your
Sure.
understanding of movement. But I also think there's something interesting to consider here when we talk about biotensegrity because it's obviously a completely different model for explaining human movement, and it looks at the system as a whole. And
Yeah.
that's an interesting conversation to have in itself because we live in a world, particularly in the Western world, where we're very reductionistic. We like to
Yep.
be able to explain things as individual parts. We
That's right.
certainly see human movement as also region specific. And I, like in my profession, I'm a physiotherapist. You see that a lot now when you watch a lecture or if you go and learn from a particular therapist who focuses purely on one area of the body, which I also see as a limitation to which we can obviously talk more about when we talk about biotensegrity. But perhaps just to elaborate, do you want to actually talk a little bit about what Tai Chi is? Because it's something that I'm not very familiar with myself. And then actually then talk about what biotensegrity is and how you see those, well, what that is and how that's influenced your thinking of the human body.
Yes. Oh, I want to tell you about my glasses.
Okay,
They
sure.
they have tiny little holes in them.
Okay. And what's
And
the
so
rationale for that?
so they work on the camera principle rather than on the magnification principle.
Okay. I don't know
Yeah.
anything about that.
Yeah. So they're called pinhole glasses. I've been using them for probably at least 25 years, and
Right.
I use them on the computer and I use them for reading.
And what's the rationale for that?
Um, well, the way an old-fashioned camera, not a digital camera, works,
Sure.
the light comes in and it goes through a tiny hole.
Okay.
and you adjust clarity by adjusting the holes.
Hmm.
So a lot of times when people get older, their near vision starts getting fuzzy. My mother's
Mm.
92. She still doesn't need glasses to read the
Mm.
newspaper. But I
Yeah,
started
wow.
needing glasses.
Hmm.
And rather than the slippery slope of magnification, I found these, and
Hmm.
they really work well. It's kind of like if you broke your arm and somebody this is how I think of it. Somebody put a cast on,
Hmm.
and then they said, now come back in 6 months and we'll give you a heavier cast. You'd say, you're crazy, right? So instead, this uses a more mechanical principle, right?
Hmm.
The physics of light to help with focus.
And I guess also then too, part of it is requiring the eyes to work in a certain way and perhaps allow them to adapt, as opposed to maladapt from magnification, where your eyes don't need
Yeah,
to work as hard.
I feel like my when I don't have them, if I'm in a situation where I don't have them, I see a lot better because they help um, with focus. So
Okay,
okay,
interesting.
so Tai Chi, um,
Yes.
more properly called Tai Chi Chuan,
Mm.
but in the West it gets called Tai Chi. Um, it's a what are called one of the internal martial arts. So sometimes called soft. It's funny words to
Mm.
use. It is a self-defense system, although I hope to never get into a fight.
Hmm.
But I started doing it when I was pregnant with my second child because I wanted a form of movement exercise that would be gentle enough
Hmm.
um, that you could do it through your pregnancy. But then I got totally hooked.
Hmm.
Um, and I even, one of the books that I co authored is on verbal Tai Chi. So it's about, which is called The Soft Answer. It's kind of about soft skills. It's based, the self defense part is based on a very light touch connection with whatever's coming in. It's a light touch that allows you to sense rather than decide in advance what I'm going to do and try to do something. I feel what is there and I respond appropriately. Um, and in a way that ideally keeps everybody safe,
Hmm.
or at the very least keeps me safe. And so Tai Chi can be very weird. You can go online and you can see, if you look up Tai Chi push on YouTube, and you can see somebody lightly putting their hands on someone and just doing this little move, and the other person goes up in the air and goes across the room.
Hmm.
And so the physics is, and I've experienced this where
Hmm.
somebody's given me that push where you don't feel it so much on your body or a change of pressure, but your body moves. Well, what's the
Hmm.
physics behind that? It didn't make sense to me. I knew it had to be explainable and understandable, but
Hmm.
nothing in our current Western understanding of bodies and movements was giving me any help with it.
Hmm.
And biotensegrity has, I would say.
Well, I was going to say there's a good segue there. And like, as you know, I recently had Graham Scar on, but I'd be interested to hear your understanding and explanation of biotensegrity and how that sort of fits into the current sort of concepts of how you look at human movement. And we'll expand from there.
Yeah. Well, I discovered it through Tai Chi because a Tai
Mm.
Chi teacher, a guest teacher who was visiting, who is also an acupuncturist, said, I think those acupunctural channels, those meridians, are functioning through this fascial system.
Mm.
You should look at the book Anatomy Trains to see what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So we got the book Anatomy Trains, and I start looking at it, and there's a picture of a tensegrity, but it's flat. It's on a piece of paper.
Mm-mm.
And I was reading the description and I thought, there's something I'm not understanding here. And Tom Myers, the author, has instructions for how to build a tensegrity. I couldn't make any sense out of that. So I went onto YouTube, found somebody, Bree Pettis, who was teaching you how to build this tensegrity thing. And, running around getting elastic bands and popsicle sticks and a saw. And when this thing popped into my hands, I was quite shocked. And I thought, why hasn't anybody told me about this? Why isn't everybody talking about this? Because what tensegrity is, not the word is made from tensional and integrity. That's the word. But what the actual structure is it's a sort of yin-yang win-win relationship between push and pull. This is how I look at it. Wherein a structure gets created, the likes of which we hadn't seen before 100 years ago. We think the first tensegrity may have been made in Russia in 1920, or certainly by Kenneth Nelson in the middle of the last century, and George Emmerich completely separately at the same time over in Europe. But the behavior, so if you think of it, beavers have been building beaver dams for hundreds of thousands of years, right? And they take something and they put it on top of something else, and they put it on top of something else. And the oldest human-made structure out of stone is something, I don't know, from 20,000 years ago or something. I don't remember, but, take a stone, put on another stone on top, put another stone on top, maybe get a log. That is what's called a continuous compression system. This is not that. Okay, you can build an entire tower and keep going up and up and up and up and over and over and over with this system, which is completely unlike the system that we've been using for hundreds of thousands of years to build. And we know it's different behaviorally. Okay, it condenses and expands in all directions at once, auxetically. I don't know if you can see that.
Well, and I was going to say,
thing gets bigger. The whole thing gets smaller, which is not what we're used to, right? We're used to squish something down and then it gets flatter and wider, squish something sideways. So this is different. Also, it's turning, it's helical when it's doing that. You watch that triangle, you'll see that it's turning. You see?
I was going to say, for people who are just listening.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. And I was going to say, I think it's actually just worth looking up what a tensegrity structure is, or perhaps going to the YouTube channel, because the visualization provides a much better explanation for understanding the concept of integrity through tension, as opposed to, as you were explaining, through compression, which is how we typically think of stability.
Yeah, but remember that you cannot have tension without compression, and you cannot have compression without tension. So that's why I'm saying Daniel Claude Martin say it's a tenso-compressional system.
Yes.
Okay. Because a pile of sticks and strings sitting on the table don't do anything. You put this together and all of a sudden there are behaviors and interactions that you wouldn't have predicted, emergent qualities, and that in, out, around movement behavior is something that Buckminster Fuller talked about as well. So then biotensegrity, right? We're taking this newly discovered thing. I mean, the mathematicians got a hold of it and they said, boy, we have to figure out, there's some new math here, some new geometry. I mean, it's really a new kind of structure. And so if you think of it, 100 years, we're just babies at even understanding tensegrity.
Mhm.
And biotensegrity is an insight that something about these tensegrity systems, maybe many things about these tensegrity systems, can inform us about the structures and behaviors and workings of biological systems, all biological systems, humans included.
Mm. Can you actually elaborate on that in terms of what that means? And like you talk about it almost like from a micro to a macro level, because I think what's good to try and understand is thinking about why we think this might be relevant to human movement and how it influences our understanding of human movement.
Well, again, for me, it was the connection with the Tai Chi classics, which was
Mm,
so weird because when you move one thing on any part of it, everything moves. One thing
mm,
moves, everything moves.
mm,
And I'm thinking, my God, this does what the Tai Chi classics have been talking about. I had no training in conventional biomechanics and stuff. I only
mm,
learned about that later. So I was coming from that perspective. Oh, and it's functioning as a system, as a unit, as a one
mhm.
with all the different aspects, pieces, parts, whatever, threaded together. And so that's one piece. Now
Mm.
ask your question again, because I think
Well, I'm just thinking then about, yeah, this concept of tensegrity. We're thinking about it from a human movement perspective and
sure.
biotensegrity. How does that actually influence, and perhaps even how does that challenge some of the conventional models of how we think about mechanics of, or
Yeah,
specifically
yeah.
biomechanics of human movement?
So I'll give you a very concrete example, right?
Hmm.
So we're talking about how this is auxetic, it expands and it condenses omnidirectionally, which
Mm,
we are not used to,
mm,
right? I mean, when you blow up a balloon, it expands in all directions at once.
hmm.
So a balloon is not a tensegrity exactly, or some people say it is. That's a physics discussion for another day.
Yes,
But
okay.
um for example, I was doing a consult with a yoga teacher who was getting ready to put some stuff about biotensegrity into her book.
Hmm.
And she had been taught that when you inhale, your lungs get wide and full and your spine gets shorter. And when you exhale, your lungs empty out and your spine gets longer. Now I can do that. I can physically configure myself to say, okay, I'm going to inhale and I'm going to see if I can make my spine shorter, and I can exhale and I'm going to see if I can make my spine longer. I can do that.
Mm,
However, how does a dog breathe? How does a baby breathe? What about if you're holding a bird? What do you feel? Okay, you feel that omnidirectional. So now, if you've been kind of trying to do this while you're listening, imagine that when you inhale, you, not just your lungs, your whole body can expand in
mm,
all directions. And that when you exhale, your whole body could condense from all directions into your center. That's just a very different way for many people to think about their breathing.
mm. Yeah, and look, it's a simple um, analogy, but I think it helps appreciate that expansion of one region of the body isn't limited to that particular segment. So that, through this concept of biotensegrity, changing the dimensions and the volume of the thorax creates then tension and, I guess, of course, compression at some elements too through the myofascial network. Hence why you will feel changes in tension throughout the whole trunk, and then also, potentially also into the upper limbs and the lower limbs, and of course the head.
Right? Where don't you feel it? That's the
Mm,
question. And if
mm,
you don't feel the change happening, if you're breathing and you don't feel any change in your legs,
mm,
why don't you? Okay, find a place in between your, where you do feel the movement of your breathing and where you don't, and
mm,
try to look at that little area and get closer and closer. Move here, move there. I do feel it, I don't. see if you can expand that.
Does that mean then, because when I think about biotensegrity, when we look at the human body from an anatomical perspective, there is more complexity than looking at a simple tensegrity model. And part of that is because when we think about the connections, in terms of the physical connections of the fascial system to the muscular to the skeletal, there's a lot going on when you think about different expansions, different connections in the body. And a lot of my understanding of the fascial system has been influenced from the research from Carla and Antonio Stecco with
Yes.
fascial manipulation. And as you're probably aware, one of the things that they discuss is the importance of the gliding between different fascial layers. That's important for optimizing human movement and mitigating things like pain or dysfunction from occurring. And so that makes me think about, from a biotensegrity standpoint, of how we might see disruption in our ability to be able to effectively transmit forces and diffuse through the human body from old injuries, trauma, overuse, and so on, that alter the tissue properties or the biomechanics of how the fascial layers glide on each other.
Okay, a lot of pieces here to what you're saying. So you're talking about the thorax, you were talking earlier, you're talking about the musculoskeletal system and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
All of these are anatomical terms generated from cutting up dead bodies.
Sure.
And then they've been given over time certain assignments. We think this is doing this, we think this is doing that, so there are a lot of embedded assumptions in that perspective that I think are beginning to be identified and re-examined. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So even when you talk about the fascial layers sliding, for example, well, what is a layer? So I wrote about this in my book, Everything Moves, How Biotensegrity Informs Human Movement. You can make a cake with layers, right? You put a layer down, you put a layer frosting, the next layer, another layer of frosting, another cake layer. But there's a different kind of cake, and I made one and took a piece outside and took a photograph to go into my book. But you make this batter and you put it in the pan, and as it cooks, it creates a bottom crust, it creates a custard layer, it creates a cake layer, it creates a top layer. Those are our layers.
Yes.
Right? Because we came from, an embryonic, unicellular human organism, the zygote, and then we became what we are today over time and differentiation. And so what we call a layer, we just have to understand how we're using the words. It's very convenient.
Sure.
You
Because it's
see what
not
I mean?
necessarily, I know for sure. So it's not simply just one layer stacked on top of another. It's like that, it's that concept of, if you pulled apart a part of the human body, the assumption that you can just put it back together and it's going to be the same as before is incorrect. And look, I think that's an important thing to highlight, because yes, the idea of these layers is something that we may be able to visualize under, say, ultrasound imaging. We may be able to palpate under our hand. And so it gives us a perhaps conceptual model of separation. But in reality, when you look at the whole system, they are still intimately connected and interdependent.
Yes, and they've always been interconnected. But
Yes.
exactly, in order to get your job done, you have to be able to think of, okay, here's the skin. You can feel your arm, and you can feel that there's bone in there somewhere. So, to that extent, we can absolutely talk about, layers, but they're areas of differentiation and densification.
Yes. Well, I often think about that too, just in terms of orthopedic surgery. And actually, probably very relevant to this conversation, because you obviously do a lot of work with Stephen Levin, who was, I guess, an orthopedic surgeon, does a lot of writing and illustrations of what biotensegrity is. And this is not to dismiss that surgery doesn't have a role, it clearly does, but the appreciation for changes in the mechanics of how that region of the body moves following surgery, particularly obviously if we're talking about relatively invasive surgery, or I think about things like ACL reconstructions where you may be using a hamstring graft. And so you're creating quite a significant change to the anatomy of an area of the body to be able to, say, restructure a ligament in this example, but thinking of the consequences for how that has in the function of the posterior thigh, both from like the isolated perspective of how the hamstring functions, but then also from much more of a systems perspective of how forces are then created or distributed through that whole region or chain within the body.
There's probably a question in there somewhere, but yes.
Yeah.
So yeah. Okay. So, yes, Steve, I'm just fortunate that when a year after I stumbled on biotensegrity, I actually got to meet Steve, and he only lives about a half hour away, depending on the traffic.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So I was just a lucky ducky in terms of that. But and he did go to his wife at the time, when he was an orthopedic surgeon and he was getting into all this, and he said, our income's going to go down because if I can take care of, because he trained as a manual therapist with John Manel. Okay, so he completely trained in that system, and that people would come to him, and he realized that with manual therapy he could take care of many problems that his training would have indicated only a surgical solution,
Yes.
would suffice. And so he said our income's going to go down, and she said, I'm fine with that. So she was a social worker. She introduced him to systems science as well, and that's how he got into that. But she was okay with a lower income resulting from fewer surgeries. So that did happen in terms of his career. And we know there are so many studies out there where they can, the argument of a picture, an MRI, an X-ray is often used for why you need surgery to relieve this back pain or whatever. But we've known for decades and decades that there's actually no correlation, that there are hundreds and thousands of people walking around with a similar picture with no pain at all. So how can we make that assumption? So it's a system. I just think it's a system where there just needs to be a lot of issues need to be revisited.
Well, with that in mind, because obviously biotensegrity is essentially trying to challenge or reconceptualize how human movement occurs, or how forces are created and distributed. Is there actually any? No, sorry.
It's not.
Okay.
I'm going to stop you right there. Okay.
Well, no, please do.
Well, this is good. I love it when we come up to a place like that, because that's where the idea is. So all Steve was trying to do with biotensegrity was try to understand better what he was encountering when he was working with human bodies. Because the textbook explanations weren't taking care of that in a full enough way. And he wasn't trying to take down biomechanics, right? It was more that he was just trying to find something that made sense. He was working as a physician around the time when the latest wave of biomechanics was really developing in the, I guess, 60s and 70s. And it didn't make sense to him from the get-go in terms of the physics and the mechanics of it. So,
well, the big thing.
Sorry.
This is an important discussion, because when I think about biomechanics, most of what we're taught is actually just mechanics, because it's about looking at basic physical laws of, here is a lever arm, here is torque, using your muscles as pulleys. And
Yes.
clearly, there are obviously some relevance to basic physical laws to human movement, but there are also a lot of limitations to explaining that. And like, I know some of these have been well illustrated or explained. Like, I think of a really good one with something like intra-abdominal pressure for spinal stability. And then I can't think of the author's name. I think it's Gressovsky or something.
Grekovetsky.
Yes. I know
Sorry,
he's
Grekovetsky.
well, but you probably can discuss it more. You probably understand this more than I do, but how some of the limitations for looking at intra-abdominal pressure as a stabilizing force for the spine, given that the actual pressures required would, and I know he says this somewhat comically, would literally make the body explode. And so,
Right.
and so it's like, okay, well, what are we missing? Because I feel like there's often that oversimplification of we understand mechanics and physical laws, and then let's apply that to the human body, call it biomechanics, but literally you're not actually considering the biological elements of tissue. And as you mentioned before, the simple one is understanding that the behavior of tissue is typically non-linear.
Yeah. Well, I mean, think of it. We're very clever, we humans, and we've come up with all these absolutely fabulous inventions, machines, and such. So then we look at a pile of bones on the ground. Now, how do we get those to move? Oh, maybe it's like that machine that I made. This is how I got it to work in the machine, so it must be something like that. And we forget that sometimes we build our machines trying to figure out what nature's doing. The whole field of biomimicry is based on that, right? So we sort of forget our own history of our assumptions. So we say, oh, the elbow is a hinge joint, the knee is a hinge joint. Well, hinge joint is a human invention, and humans evolved long before the hinge joint was invented by humans. So the chances that biology would find exactly the machine that some humans later invented hundreds of thousands of years later seems a little slim. You see? But we don't bring a lot of things into question. We get taught this is that, and we say, okay. And it's because people were trying to understand what was going on. And so they cut into the bodies and started taking them apart and seeing what things are, and naming pieces and imagining what piece did what. But I cannot get inside you and see what's doing what. As soon as I put something inside you, even an endoscope, as with Dr. Gimberto's work, as soon as I put something inside you, I've changed something fundamental about the territory. Right? So I can see living tissues behave and respond to perturbations, but how do I know what's going on when I'm not in that room? You see? So we have in the body, we have kinematic indeterminacy, which is that mathematically, I can't be sure if I'm pushing on your arm where exactly that force is getting distributed and how it's getting distributed. We work with this kind of thing in Tai Chi a lot, where somebody will stand and then try to comfortably manage a force that somebody puts on them and improve their structural integration and coherence so that any force that goes on the arm gets transferred through the body to the ground. Whereas if my body is, as it says in the Tai Chi classics, disordered and confused, then when somebody pushes on my arm, they'll push me over. But I've had people much larger than me, when I have a chance to get that integration together, and then I can say, okay, push as hard as you like. They're pushing the floor.
It's interesting. I think of a video I've seen before, and it's of a judo master,
Yep,
dueling with I guess, a student of his. And the judo master essentially cannot be disarmed from the judo attacks because when he's going to be attacked or flipped, he allows his body to essentially soften, and he obviously understands how to respond to the particular movement so that the other person cannot use their body to their mechanical advantage. And
that's
so,
right.
it makes me just think about what you were explaining there, that ultimately how our body responds to external perturbations is very much influenced by the tension or stiffness and rigidity that we create in our body to determine where forces then are distributed.
Yes, and this thing that I'm talking about, this integration, is not done by tensing.
Mm.
If I
Yes,
tense
okay.
my muscles, you will very easily be able to push me over.
Mm.
This is a different thing that comes from being, it's very hard to explain, but you're relaxed and you're integrating.
Mm.
And so it's a slightly different thing, but you're right. I mean, judo, aikido, shingi, bagua, tai chi, a lot of Wing Chun, a lot of different in what they call soft or internal martial arts systems are using these principles all the time. If you I mean, I can give you an exercise to do where you can maybe start to do it yourself
Mm.
if you want to give it a try, or you don't have to give it a try, you can try it later. But
Sure.
if you take something with a little bit of substance to it that's tall, like a lamp or
Mm.
a hat stand or something, and you lean it on your shoulder and you feel the weight, and then you try to integrate yourself such that you connect with it, you become one with it, and you let the weight of it be distributed through your whole system, you'll start to be able to feel that weight go through you to ground to the opposite foot.
Mm.
It's a very conscious engagement of the system
Mm.
that is non-muscular. If you try to
Mm.
resist with muscles, you'll just get tired. You need something
Mm.
that's going to be sustainable that you could do. If I said, okay, now stay there, I'll be back in 45 minutes, you'd
Mm.
say, okay, no problem.
Mm.
That's the sweet spot, the place you're looking for. And I think when we
Efficiency.
don't, yeah, exactly. It's the energy efficiency, which we
Mm.
already know about. So, I grew up in New England, and we get snow in the winter, and you got to push cars out of the snow. And then here in the South, in the United States, they're always having to push cars out of the mud.
Mm.
If you have to do something like that, you're much smaller than a car, you
Mm.
know, and even if there are two or three of you
Mm.
and somebody's in the driver's seat helping, you're much smaller than a car. You can't use your muscles and your body weight. You have to gently rock the car. You have to gather
Mm.
yourself together, and that physical action that you go through of gathering yourself to do the action. That's the kind of integration I'm talking about.
Yeah, and that's actually a good explanation because, and I actually spoke to Graham about this because I think another example that I often use, which highlights some of the complexity of the human system, is something like sprinting. Because when you sprint, our ground reaction forces are magnitudes higher than our body weight. And so it's how are we able to tolerate such high forces? And part of that is about not using our muscular system to overcome those forces. It's about how we utilize those ground reaction forces to be able to absorb and then also then to distribute back those forces into the ground. And the car analogy I think is another good example because how is it that you're able to create more force? Is well, you're using the momentum of the car to help be able to absorb and then redistribute forces, and over time build that up.
Biological organisms are really opportunistic.
Mm. Yes.
Okay. And we evolved in a gravitational field.
Mm.
So we evolved I believe, people studying biotensegrity are, surmising, because any explanation for what's going on needs to be able to work from a developmental perspective, from an evolutionary perspective. For all biological systems doing all kinds of things in all kinds of places, the explanation has to work for all of them. And as soon as it doesn't, then we need to re-examine the philosophy, the concept. So all organisms evolved in a gravitational field, even if they're evolved in the water, right? There's still gravity there, even though it's there's also the water pressure.
Sure.
So we've evolved in a system of water pressure, air pressure, gravity. And so I think it makes sense that organisms take advantage of that energy that's already there. It can't be that I'm exhausting myself to get enough food to eat to generate the power for everything I do from within. That's so inefficient.
In the tensegrity model, as you demonstrated before, there are tensional elements and there are compressional struts that hold, that maintain the shape. So when we think about biotensegrity to the human body, we can think about the myofascial system as the tensional elements, and we think about the skeletal system as and you can correct me here, as compressional elements. But the thing that's different to the human body is we have one bone stacked on top of each other. And that's obviously different to
You do
this
not,
is where
my friend.
this is where I'm interested to hear your thoughts, because I have read
Yes.
some of Stephen's stuff, because that's obviously different to, at least the perspective of how we think about the skeletal system and how you look at a
Absolutely.
tensegrity model. Can you actually explain and elaborate further on how that is explained from a biotensegrity perspective?
Yeah, and of course that's a macro scale view, that idea of tendons, ligaments, muscles. The fascial system works at different scale levels within the system. The bones are at a macro scale level, but even within bone, the bone is a tensegrity structure, right? So, and the bone is fascial tissue, right? It is calcified, but it is still fascia. So, and this model goes down to the subcellular level and down to the atomic level. So it works at all scale levels. But just looking at the more macro scale levels. Now I need your question again. Sorry, I just wanted to.
Thinking about the compressional struts and how,
Yes.
when you think about the skeletal system, we think of them as being stacked on top of each other.
Yeah. So this is a very old view, right? You'll see in my book, I've got this picture of the Djed column out of Egypt, where it's the, I think it's the spine of Isis or something, imagined as a column, right? Like a building. And so we imagine it goes back hundreds and possibly thousands of years that we think of our spine as a column like a building. But the truth is that none of our bones touch each other. None of them. All of the bones are sesamoid bones. All of the bones have space between them. Have you seen, I'm sure you have, but I would recommend that people look up x-rays of like a baby's arm. And the space between the bones almost looks alarming to us because we're so used to thinking of like the song, right? Hip bone's connected to the thigh bone's connected to the, right? So we're used to thinking of it that way, but they're not connected.
And do we have any evidence to support that? Because I know Stephen Levin has made some comments about this from
Sure.
his professional experience.
I mean, lots. I mean, just look up. Okay, so there's two things: that the bones are under compression, and that the bones are not touching each other. Just look at X-rays. Only when somebody's got a bone-on-bone problem right? When somebody wants to tell you about a problem in their knee or whatever, they'll say, it's really bad, it's bone on bone. Nobody comes back and says, what do you mean? I thought it was all bone on bone. Bone on bone is fine. No, so some part of us knows that there's fluid there, that there's space there, right?
Yes.
Now take a look, go online, do a visual image search of broken arms and broken legs. When that bone breaks into two pieces, a clean break, not a hairline, the two ends get closer to each other and one piece is over, and you know what I mean? One broken piece is over another.
Sure.
Only if the bone had been under compression would it behave that way when broken. Do you see what I'm saying? You will never see, or I have never seen when I've gone to look, a situation where somebody's broken a femur or broken a humerus and it's separated apart. If the bones were under tension, there'd be more space between them after the break.
What role does cartilage play then? Because I guess some people might go, well, the space that you see between bones on an X-ray is filled by cartilage that creates compression.
Cartilage, yeah. So in the mesenchyme, during development, right, the mesenchymal tissue will become cartilage or bone if under compression, and will become tendon, ligament, muscle if under tension. The same cells. So going way back, they were all the same cells, but depending on what was happening, the forces that they were managing, they become different things. So I think it's a great question. What's going on with cartilage? I don't think we know. I think we only know some of what's going on with bone, with muscle, with ligament, with tendon. I mean, we're still learning this. There's a saying, about how in 20 years we're going to realize half of what we know is wrong. We just don't know which half.
Yeah.
So
That's funny. I always think about that, where history is filled with events of being so sure about a certain knowledge or concept, only to find out later on that it was completely wrong. Like a good example of that is neuroplasticity. I think about not that long ago, it was assumed that the brain could never adapt or change. Yet, as we've found out since then, that's so far from the actual truth.
Right. We thought the lymph system ended at the neck. It didn't go up into the head. And then they found how it got up into the head. And then they looked and they found it in the head, I mean, these things happen all the time where you'll see an article. It's like, oh, we have to rewrite the textbook,
You recently co-authored a paper with Stephen Levin titled Bouncing Bones.
Yes.
Can you explain what the purpose of that paper was, and specifically explain what you mean by bones acting like springs during locomotion?
Sure. Well, the whole body is a springy system, right? And we know that, we know that if you, when a surgeon puts a knife in for an incision, the skin pulls apart. It never gets closer together. So we know that's under tension, right?
Yes.
And I was talking about the bones, we know they're under compression because for different reasons. Okay. Think of, I don't know if you've ever seen like a blade spring, or it gets called different things, but
Okay.
You could have stilts where instead of a spring that's a wound round spring, you just have one bent piece of metal. One long piece of metal with a slight bend in it that somebody springs on.
Okay. Yes.
You see what I mean? That kind of
Yes.
spring. Okay. If you, I mean, that any model, Graham said it the other day when I listened to the podcast. He quoted George E.P. Bach's, all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Yes.
So remember that I'm grasping at models here that are never going to be complete. right?
But to try to allude to a phenomenon that may occur,
Yeah,
yes.
exactly. So those kind of blade springs are stiff,
Mm,
hard springs. And if you have one of those, or even a very heavy wound spring next to a much lighter one, and they're both the same height, and you put a force upon, you have them in with a board at the bottom of the top, and you
mm,
push down on the board.
mhm,
It's the heavy spring, it's the denser spring that's going to compress and take more of that pressure. The littler spring will also move, of course, but
mm,
it's not taking the weight, the
mm.
force that the bigger spring is taking. Okay, so we just
Yes.
know this mechanically.
Yes.
So then in that case, what would our what do we have within us which are springy things, and we know bones
Mm,
are springy,
mm,
um and that would be able to contain, would be able to take in the most force,
mm,
and that would be the bones. Why are our bones on the inside? Why don't we have an exoskeleton?
mm,
We have an endoskeleton. And so we're conjecturing that those forces are coming in through the softer of the soft matter tissues on the outside
mm,
and being brought into the bone for storage.
mm.
You see? For greater storage and then response back out again.
It's well, to actually highlight that point, there's a study that I came across a couple of years ago, and it was looking at the ground reaction forces and the forces experienced of at the bone in the triple jump. So triple jump, you can appreciate uh, there are very high ground reaction forces as you do the skip hop jump. So, and particularly, I can't remember what part of the triple jump, which specific element it is, but the ground reaction forces are huge, like 6 to 8 times your body weight.
Right, right.
And when you think about bone adapting, we think, well, it has to do with the large ground reaction force that causes the compressional force through the skeletal system. But it was interesting to note that actually the thing that you see where the peak forces occur is in response to the ground reaction force. When the myofascial system then tries to absorb those forces and contract, those forces from the myofascial system, when they connect into the bone, cause the highest peak amount of force. And that to me sort of just fits in with what you're explaining here, that our bones are the elements that we use to distribute forces into, but it may not necessarily be through the ground reaction force, but actually through our myofascial system responding in response to the ground reaction force.
Yeah, a force is an interaction, and
Mm,
it can only be measured where the foot is hitting that force plate, right? If
mm,
in this case that you're talking about. What's going on once it gets to the other side of the skin? We're only conjecturing. You
yes.
see, we have
Yes.
to conjecture based on what we understand of physics as we know it and material science as we know it. We're
Mm,
kind of limited to that, right? What tensegrity, the innovation of tensegrity does is it gives us a whole new area of material interaction
mm,
capabilities and possibilities to look at that we didn't have before.
mm.
We didn't have this 100 years ago.
What value do you think biotensegrity plays in, I guess, in understanding how humans function? Because I'm just trying to think about this from a clinical perspective. For me as a physiotherapist, a lot of what I do is related to how I apply forces to the body, whether that be through manual therapy, whether that be through exercise modalities. What do you think biotensegrity, what role does that play with how we understand about mechanical forces and what we may do from a clinical or therapeutic standpoint?
Sure. Um, I work with a lot of physiotherapists, and there's actually a course. It's in its second year now, for physiotherapists on, who are applying biotensegrity. What's interesting is each of them learns about biotensegrity, then takes the work they're doing, because different people have different training.
Yes.
And they find a new way to use this information to help them do what they already know better. Okay, so a lot of people are like, oh my God, I can't understand biotensegrity. It's too much. Okay, just try, because even understanding a little bit might create a positive change. Now, one of the women in the course started changing a little bit of how she was treating clients, and she got pushback from her supervisors because
Yes.
the insurance is only going to pay for
Hmm.
you to do 10 sessions. And if the problem is in the shoulder, here are the protocols. And if the problem's in the
Yes.
hip, here are the protocols. And she started really drawing outside the lines. And she ended up leaving the job and going into private practice because the people she was working with were getting better results. And she thought it was starting to feel irresponsible to work within a system that was sort of demanding a limited scope of results. Do you see what I mean? It was almost like I may say a fear-based system rather than, and it's for protecting people. I understand how it gets there and why those protocols are in place, but if we're not open to consider new ways of looking at the body and looking at interactions that the body has with its environment differently, how can we improve?
Well, and absolutely, and I guess the thing that really highlights the highlight to me as you explain it then is biotensegrity is a model to explain and look at the body as a whole system. And in
Yes.
reality, when you think about, say, like musculoskeletal injury, like I think of, say, hamstring strains, we're following a hamstring injury, you are going to develop deficits within the hamstring muscle. That may be things like flexibility, strength, power, and so on. And certainly you need to think about how you restore some of those tissue capacities so the hamstring can function effectively. But we also need to consider then other maladaptations that occur through the kinetic chain. And in fact, I actually gave a presentation recently talking about this. And there's some recent research done of looking at changes within the thoracolumbar fascia in the people who have had a hamstring injury versus those who didn't, where you see an increase in stiffness of the thoracolumbar fascia. And in fact, there's other evidence to demonstrate that seeing an increase in stiffness can alter the biomechanical properties of how the thoracolumbar functions during tasks like deadlifting and most likely things like sprinting, which is often when hamstring injuries occur. So straight away, and it's not too much of a leap to think about the hamstring to the thoracolumbar fascia because they are relatively close. We know that there is an anatomical relationship between the two. But the current model of looking at something like the hamstrings as an independent actuator doesn't allow you to appreciate that as effectively. And I know for me too, when I think about the fascial system and how prior injuries can alter the mechanics of the fascial system, that can lead to changes in the mechanics somewhere else through the kinetic chain that may contribute to pain or dysfunction as well. So I guess a big element of this is thinking about, we hear a lot of these ideas about being holistic, looking at the whole body. I think that's often very much a key thesis when you look at some of the traditional paradigms of looking at the human body. But I guess we're now trying to think about how we can apply or explain this from a Western perspective, which biotensegrity perhaps provides some insight into thinking of a model that may be complete or incomplete, because like you said, not all models are perfect, but it certainly provides some insight into thinking about how we can think about human movement from a whole systems perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are acupuncturists who put a needle in your ear and they're treating your liver or your knee or your, it's how, Those are we think those aren't connected. And
Mm,
one of the examples I sometimes give is, you take your car into the mechanic and you say the right front wheel is squeaking.
mm.
Take a look, and they start looking at your radio. You're going to say, "What are you doing?" I'm asking you to look at the right front wheel.
Yes,
That's appropriate, right?
yes,
Because the radio
yes.
is built to be a radio and the wheel's built to be a wheel. And
They're all
each piece,
separate structures.
yeah, that are very carefully tooled.
Yes,
Every piece does one thing and one thing only.
yes,
What part of your body is not connected to another part?
yes. And
There's no part that's not connected to all the other parts.
no, and look, whether it be looking at, say, some of the Tom Myers anatomical models, obviously, like Carlos Stecco has done a lot of work of looking at the interconnections of the myofascial system. And interestingly, too, and they're starting to look more into this, of looking at the anatomical relationships of the visceral fascia, and then by extension, the visceral fascia to the muscular fascia, because these aren't necessarily things that are separate entities. We do actually see
Yes.
anatomical relationships and continuity. And I mean, we obviously need to take that with the caveat of, like you mentioned before, because we dissect the body to try and see how the things are connected, but through dissection, we also lose some of the whole system's interactions anyway. But besides that, we do actually see very intimate, continuous anatomical relationships, if we, depending on how we dissect the body.
And if I can go back to your question about the therapists,
Mm,
I had a Tai Chi student who was a massage therapist, and she was having a pain at a point in her back.
mm,
And I was working with her saying, look, when you're working with your client, you're part of a system. It's the ground, your body, their body.
mm,
If they're laying on the bench, that's, on a table, that's the ground,
mm,
right? And then through the legs of the table, it's like it's a whole system
mm.
that's circular through the ground up through both of you whenever you're touching them. If
Yes.
you're thinking that you've got to generate these forces just with your muscles, and then you're uh intensively directing some force inadvertently to a certain part of your back,
Mm,
it's going to complain, it's going to hurt. You need to have a whole system distribution thing going on as you interact with another person's body. And she said, no, I saw the pictures, I really need the surgery. So they did the surgery. I can't remember whether it was thoracic or cervical area. Anyway, and then 6, 8, 12 months later,
mm,
guess what? She had a pain in her
mm.
lower back. And guess what? They wanted to do another fusion. And I said again, I really think, do you see what I'm saying? That if you could
Absolutely.
look at yourself as a system and you could work that way with the bodies you're working with. So I think it's potentially a self-protective awareness that can be gained
Mm,
for the manual therapist as well.
mm. Susan, a question I always like to ask our guests, and I think perhaps you've already explained this already, is things that you're interested in outside of your professional work. But I guess perhaps so much of what you do really feeds into some of the stuff you're doing with biointegrity anyway.
Yeah, it doesn't, it's like it connects with everything, right?
Mm, mm,
But that's okay. Yeah, well, I do this verbal self-defense, soft answers stuff.
mm.
Um, and something that I've been getting into recently, this is completely out of the box because I think that's what you're looking for, is I've been getting into composting through the Bokashi system.
Okay, I haven't. I
Yeah,
compost myself, but I don't know the Bokashi system.
check it out.
Okay.
What it's a relatively recent kind of innovation,
Mm,
and you are pickling the compost
okay.
anaerobically. So you get this bran that's got it's been inoculated with some wonderful whatever bacteria,
Mhm,
and you
mhm.
sprinkle that in layers, and then you push down the top
Mm,
so that it's anaerobic, no air, and it kind of
mm.
pickles. And
Right.
it's really brilliant, incredible. system that I think has only been around for maybe 50 years or so.
Okay.
So check out the Bokashi composting system.
I'll be sure to look it up. Susan, for people who want to find out more about who you are or what you do, where would you recommend they find out information about you?
Well, on the Biotensegrity Archive YouTube channel, you can see tons of hours and hours and hours of Biotensegrity party events, episodes that we've had with me, Chris Marita Clancy, and Graham Scar hosting. So if you're into Biotensegrity, that's one way to look. If you want to join us live when we do them, go to biotensegrityarchive.org and get on our email list.
Yes.
If you want to ask me a question, you can go to embodiedbiotensegrity.ca, as in Canada, and they have a lot of great resources for anybody interested in biotensegrity, and also outside the paywall, they have an Ask Susan section.
Okay,
so
great.
you can, so it's completely free, and you can go in and ask me anything.
Well, and to our listeners, please do like, share, subscribe, comment. It's a really great way for us to be able to spread our message and reach more listeners. Susan, thank you very much for being here. It's been a very insightful conversation, and I like these conversations that really challenge paradigms or perspectives, because we all have a certain bias of how we look at the human body, or I guess anything in the world, in reality, and that's very much influenced by our own, say, professional learning and what we've been taught. So it's great to get some insights into thinking about how we can challenge those perspectives, and perhaps give some insights into how we shift by looking at the human body.
I have to say, I really enjoyed getting into a number of your podcasts, and I love the way you work. You're interviewing such a fabulous range of people who are doing work in the human health, body work, movement, science fields, and I think you're really getting the best out of all of them. It's really wonderful. You're doing a great service.
No, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. All right, Susan, take care.
All right. Bye-bye, Jack.